Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today, I'm going to be comparing the British government with the US government. And in order to start this off, I want to address, the source of authority of these governments. Of course, I've done discussions just talking about the history of the British government and, of course, their monarchy. The early part of the 11th century, they had a an absolute monarch, right, William the Conqueror, and of course he and his descendants claimed the divine right of kings, that their absolute power, you know, came from God. And why did they say this? Because of course the church said so, right? The church, of course, had crowned the Pope Leo III had crowned Charlemagne, right, who was king of the Franks, Charlemagne, and of course, the subsequent European kings, including the King of England, they took their precedent from that crowning of Charlemagne. How did the church come about this notion of divine rights of kings, right? Which later kings of England were also claiming, and of course they had the back and forth with their barons. Well, the Pope got the notion of divine rights from the Bible, right? From the Christian Holy Bible. So I'm going to quickly read from the Christian Holy Bible today. So you can see I actually have a this is a King James version of the Bible. This is the written by King James, right? We've talked about King James. He was the beginning of the Stuart kings, and he succeeded Queen Elizabeth the First, King James the First. So let me quickly read this this these verses from the Bible. I'm reading from Romans 13 verses 1 to 2. Interesting, today is actually a Sunday. I went to church today, and so it's just appropriate. Romans chapter 13, from verse 1 to 3. Let every soul, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the devil, but to the evil. Sorry. So I'm going to move forward and just also add, this where it says, uh, here, this is from verse 6. It says, For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Verse 7, Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Okay, so that's from the King James Bible, and of course King James, that's the main version that Protestant Christians still use today. And of course, it was from King James the First of England. This was from 1611, and so you see, I'm reading from Shakespearean language, or early modern English. So it's also called Shakespearean language, and which we still understand today, obviously, because we still use it in churches and in most church services till today. So that was the source of the authority and the claim of divine rights that the English monarchs were claiming, right? So we see that subsequently in English history, the barons of the kings, and who formed parliament, were engaged in this constant struggle with the king to get more power away from the king. So we see even the source of when you say tributes and dues, That's taxes, right? So it's the church, the church and the governments interpreted it as taxes. You know that the king was entitled to taxes, and it was this issue of taxation that was constantly causing friction, right, between the king and, of course, his barons. The barons would go on to form the first parliament, right? Today, those barons, of course, are in the House of Lords. Today, the English Parliament is bicameral. It first started as being unicameral. Today, it's bicameral, and it has a House of Lords and a House of Commons. So, um, and of course, America, we got our model, our template from the British system. In fact, one of our founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, that's Alexander Hamilton, he's known to have said that the British government was the best form of government in the world and known to man. Um, Even John Adams, our second president, also said it that uh, if you remove corruption, the British form of government was the best, right? So obviously, we took a lot of elements from the British government, and so I'm going to do comparisons. I'm going to show how we did model our government and even our branches of government after the British model. The British model has evolved over time, right? It was done by accident and constant struggle, as Karl Marx would call it dialectics, right? Some form of class struggle. So that's how Karl Marx comes up with his theories, because he's reading, he's checking history, he's seeing what's really going on, and he's noticing a pattern. And that's why he says, look, there's this pattern between, that's thesis and antithesis, or you can call it a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, or you can call it, some constant class struggle between people at different, stations in life, and the lower is struggling to take power from the top. In this case, the barons who are under, they're subservient to the king, and they're trying to take power from the king, and eventually they do take power from the king, and then the House of Commons, mainly made up of the mercantile class, the burgesses, the townspeople who were rising up, right? They now struggle, and by the 20th century, the House of Commons, the lower house, had actually become more powerful than the House of Lords, which took power from the king. Of course, it was the barons, the barons, the landed people. They're the ones who first started those struggles. All the way in the 13th century, they forced King John to have the Magna Carta, and Simon de Montfort, he forced the first parliament, the Oxford Parliament. This was in 1258, and subsequent parliaments. So you see how the struggle, continued up until the 20th century, and leaving the king as a ceremonial figure, right? So something I want us to notice is, in the beginning, it was the king who was forced to create parliament, right? So the king is the executive. So the king embodied the executive power. So he was the head of state, and he was also the head of government. And so he created parliament. Parliament is the equivalent of our Congress. And so what I'm going to do today is just show how Parliament and our US Congress, the English Parliament, which houses the House of Lords and the House of Commons, a bicameral legislature, is equivalent to our US Congress, which has our Senate and House of Representatives, which is also a bicameral body. So in the beginning, it was the king, the English king, who was forced to create parliament. He created parliament, right? Because the king had absolute power in the beginning. At the time of William the Conqueror, 11th century, he was the judiciary, he was the lawmaking body, he was the executive, the enforcer of the laws. All power was in his hands. And he was also a military power. Now, these barons that I've been talking about, the aristocrats, right, the even the English aristocracy, right? So in the 11th century, notes in the medieval era, they were not just land or holding lords, right? They were also warlords. They were military powers, equivalent of generals, right? Because one of the services that they owed the king in exchange for him giving them their lands, because all lands, right? All lands is supposed to belong to the king. All English lands belong to the king. In fact, even today, as a legal fiction, all lands still are supposed to be you know, be owned by the king, right? The King of England till today, even though he's now a ceremonial figure. Um, so in the beginning, these barons, these aristocrats, they were actually what they were is they were military leaders, right? The dukes, the earls, the barons, they were military leaders because something they owed their king was military service, right? Military service. Because remember, the English kings were constantly at war, particularly the English kings who had all these lands. They had these duchies in France, like the because the King of England up until the 14th century was the Duke of Normandy, was the which was all in France, right? Making them a vassal um, of their of you know the, of their sovereign, the French sovereign, the French king. So the King of England, was the Duke of Normandy, was the Duke of Gascony, the Duke of Aquitaine, the Count of Anjou. So this led them to be constantly at war with the King of France, who was trying to seize those lands, right? Because he saw his vassal was king of another country and was trying to claim these lands as well. So the barons owed the king military service, right? So that was how they started off, right? So notice that. So the king, right, the executive was the one who created, that's the king. He had absolute power. He created parliament. He created the lawmaking body, right? However, that's not how it was for us in the US. It was Congress, the Constitutional Convention, right, which is Congress. And I'm going to get into words, the meanings of these words, and show the origins. It was Congress, the Constitutional Convention, which created the executive, which gave, which gave our president his powers, right? So now let me quickly get into reminder of something. So we got up onto I've done videos in an earlier video in which we had gotten up to the 17th century. By the time of 1649, when there had been the Civil War and the parliamentarians went to war, which was mainly made up of, at least the Puritans were more powerful than the parliamentarians, so they had this crisis over this issue, conflict over religion. So basically, the Protestants going to war against their King Charles I, who had these leanings, sympathies for Catholics. He had taken a Catholic wife, and so they went to war. There were other issues as well, of course, regarding taxation. Remember, the Parliament had been gradually, they've been chipping away at the power of the king, taking away his power, taking away his, so trying to make him subservient to them, and they use taxation as a tool. They use taxation as a tool to extort more powers, coerce to extort more powers from the king. So, but in this instance, one of the main issues, flashpoint was religion, right? So eventually the parliamentarians defeated the royalists. The royalists were the side of the king. They went to war, the Civil War, and they had the king, Charles I, beheaded. They charged him with high treason. He was convicted. They had him beheaded. Now, after that, Oliver Cromwell, who was a general, he was from the common class. He was a commoner, so he's the only, the first, and only, well, he's the first commoner to rule England, right? He's the first commoner to rule England, because now we see today the prime ministers, they're from the House of Commons. So the prime minister is head of government today, right? So the roles of the executive have changed. The king is no longer an absolute power. He's a constitutional monarch. He's really head of state. He's a ceremonial head. He's a figurehead. Even though he has to sign documents and things like that and give his nominal approval, right? The real head of government is the prime minister, the English prime minister today. That's Keir Starmer. He was a former barrister, a lawyer, and of course, And following that tradition, I think he's an Oxford graduate as well. So you see that those schools have remained very relevant, and they've continued that tradition, the English tradition. So um, at that time in the 17th century, uh, the king was beheaded. Oliver Cromwell, who was a general, a military leader, and from the House of Commons, he assumed the role of Lord Protector. He was offered king, he refused it. He was offered to be a king, he refused it. And he was a Protestant, he was a Puritan. His rule was very draconian. When he died, his son succeeded him briefly, Richard. But you see, after he left, there were a series of coups, right? There was now instability, a series of coups by generals, including General Lambert. There was a George Monk. So there was instability. So Parliament, which had actually uh, defeated the royalists, the king, and unseated the king, they dissolved themselves and decided to form a convention parliament, right? A convention parliament. To remember, so it's not just like us after our war and we had the Articles of Confederation, we formed a constitutional convention in 1787 to decide on the form of a strongest form of government, right? So you see the similarities, how the English form of government, their system, their history was a model for us to follow in the United States. And again, later on, the convention parliament decided to to restore the monarchy. So the son of Charles I, Charles II, was restored as a king. Of course, uh, so that was one of the first times, and they limited his powers. So uh, you know, in fact, prior to that, remember the in 1327, Parliament had deposed a king in 1327. That's Edward II. They deposed him and he was silently killed. And they confirmed his son, Edward III, as king, and there was a regency. So you see, Parliament had that pattern of taking, just taking away power from the king. And then in 1688, 1689, what was called the Glorious Revolution, Parliament again unseated their king. They deposed their king. They said they'd gone to conspire with William of Orange, who was the nephew of the king. That's James II. James II was Catholic, and he was openly showing that he wanted to make England Catholic. And of course, he had an infant son, and he christened him as a Catholic. And they realized which path he was going, which path he was following. He was going to be he wanted to be a Catholic king, and so the Protestant Parliament didn't like that, and so they conspired with William of Orange, who was the nephew. He was the ruler of Holland, the Dutch ruler, and he was Protestant. And incidentally, the wife of William of Orange was Mary. Right, Mary was a daughter of the king, James II, whom they were conspiring against, whom they were having deposed again. So they claimed he abdicated because he fled. Right, he fled. He went to go and get forces. So William of Orange marched in with maybe over 10,000 troops, 11,000 troops, of almost 15,000. He came into England, but there was no war because James too fled to France, to Louis the King, Louis the 14th, to seek protection. And so again, Parliament had another convention of Parliament, and in this instance, they effectively made the king they made their government a constitutional monarchy. So the king was just ceremonial; it was just a head of state, and there was now the Parliament was stronger. They had they the effective executive powers had been taken away from the king. And I've done videos in which I explained all of this earlier. And of course, um, George and Mary didn't live long. They died. And of course, they had the Act of Settlement of 1701, which assured that the Princess Sophia, who was Electress of Hanover, right? Hanover was was a principality, was a sovereign, state in Germany. And Princess Sophia was actually granddaughter of King James the First, and so but she was Protestant, and so the Parliament devised a means by which the descendants of Princess Sophia, who were, going to be, who were Protestants, would have the claims to the throne of England. And so when William died, Queen Mary's sister, his wife died first. So Queen Mary's sister Anne succeeded. She died without an heir, leaving an heir because her son had died, at 11. She had 17 pregnancies, by the way. Her kids died, but so um, her son died, and so they made George the First, who was German. He became King of England, but he retained his title as Elector of Hanover. He couldn't speak English. He was German. He could barely speak English. So Parliament let him. He liked staying because ruling in Germany. So he liked to rule his Hanoverian entity domain. So he was mainly there, and so Parliament was effectively running the government of the United Kingdom. By this time, there was a guy who became de facto prime minister. His name was Robert Walpole, Sir Robert Walpole. He became the first de facto prime minister of England, and so he was essentially running the government. And the king was just a ceremonial king by this time. This was after 1714, right? And so George the First, George the Second, and George the Third. So by the time of our revolution, the Revolutionary War of 1776, you see, America, we followed the pattern of England, and we created a constitutional convention. Now, in the Convention of Parliament, from the Glorious Revolution in England, you see that um, they limited the power. They had a Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights of 1689, and of course, you see, we had a Bill of Rights when we from 1791 in our use, which was attached, which became part of our U.S. Constitution. So it had a lot of elements and provisions like the English Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights was basically taking power away from the king and putting power in the hands of Parliament, right? It included provisions, clauses like on freedom of speech, right? Um, prevent barring uh, uh, excessive bills, excessive fines, no cruel and unusual punishment, and so it's essentially was checking the power of the king, and of course it ensured that it now made the king subservient to parliament. So because the parliament was now effectively able to control legislation, right? They were now the lawmaking body. They controlled legislation, and also they controlled taxation. They controlled public expenditure. They controlled the purse of the king. In fact, they granted the king about £700,000 a year. So basically, so who pays you, right, is your boss, right? It's who writes your check that's your boss. So Parliament was now the one. They now controlled the king. They controlled government. They're now preeminent, and you see that's the way it is in America as well. It's Congress which authorizes um, uh, Congress which authorizes expenditures, pays, and things like that, taxation. Now, what's interesting is in England again, it was the monarchs that created Parliament because they believed they had divine rights. They believed the source of the authority was from God, according to the Bible, which I read from. In America, it's Congress that gave the president powers. But where, many people have raised concerns that, our president is becoming so powerful and things like that, becoming really powerful. And, is president able to check the powers, is Congress able to check the powers of the president, right? So I'll get into that in a subsequent video. So I've gotten up to the point of, our Constitutional Convention of 1787, and of course I've compared it with the Convention Parliament of England. Now, why? So, um, so we both have a legislative body, right? Why did we decide to call ours Congress and the British government calls theirs Parliament? Why didn't we just call ours Parliament as well? Because they're essentially the same thing. Let me compare, right? England, by the time of which till today, by the time of the Revolution, they had a bicameral legislature, right? They had the House of Lords, right, which is you can call the upper chamber, and then they had the House of Commons, the lower chamber. If you look at what we have in America as well, and by the time what we created, we had an upper house, which is the Senate. We have a lower house, which is the House of Representatives, right? And they essentially do the same things as well, right? Um, why did we decide to call them different things? So in England, again, their lawmaking body is called Parliament, right? And so it's legislature. It's a legislative body. I went into the the origin of the evolution and development of the English language for a reason. So if you notice, so our lawmaking body, right, is called uh, Congress, and that's a legislative body. So our government is divided into three branches: the judiciary, the legislature, which is Congress, and the executive, which is what the president, runs. So the legislature is what I want to compare today: the American legislature and the English legislature. So legislature, that word is from Latin, right? Its roots is from Latin, and legis is Latin. It means law. Later is also Latin. It means proposer, right? So if you put it together, legislator, it just means proposer of law, right? Or which makes the law. So the lawmaking body. So you see, it means the same thing. We got it from English, and it's a term that evolved from. It has Roman roots in it, Latin. Now, I had mentioned how Parliament, right? Parliament is derived from a French word, parlement, right? Parlement, which also is the root of the origin of the word parler, which is, they're the same thing. Parler is, to discuss, to speak. Parlement, to speak. Parlement is actually, which although French, which is to settle a dispute, to speak, it actually has a Latin root to it as well. Parabolare, that's a Latin, which means to speak. Parabola, which means speech. So parabolare, which means to speak. That's the Latin, right? Now, if you look at what we have, so the English, they have parliament, that's what it is, where they speak. In America, um, we have Congress, right? We call it Congress, not Parliament. What does Congress mean? Congress is also from Latin. Congressus, from Latin, congressus or congredi. Congredi is also is Latin, which means to come together. So maybe we wanted to alter its significance. Remember, I'd mentioned how the English language has the most synonyms, right? Of any language, has tons of synonyms. And so Congress means to come together, coming together. It turns out, if you look in the English dictionary, it tells you that Congress is actually synonymous, right? If you check the thesaurus, it says Congress is synonymous with Parliament, right? So they mean the same thing. It's just one way of calling one thing another, right? So they're synonymous, right? They're equivalent. So they're similar. Congress, Parliament. We just decided to use different terms, right? Consistent with the the synonyms and the multiplicity in the English language, right? The versatility of the English language. So it's the same, it means the same thing. Congress, to come together. And Even the convention, right? You notice that convention that we used, it's also from Latin. What does convention mean? It's Latin, it's from Latin, conventio, which originates from convenire. Convenire. Convenire means, convenire is Latin, it actually means coming together, to come together. So you see, convention, congress, they mean the same thing. So they're all synonymous, right? So you see the significance, how the English system was a model for us to follow, right? And of course, the English system sort of has its roots from the Roman Empire, from Latin. And again, remember, our founding fathers were students of the classics, but they're students of English history as well. I've done videos just discussing things they borrowed from the English government. Now, interesting though, we didn't call our leader king, right? We didn't call him a king, even though there are people who wanted to make George Washington a king, but we didn't call him king. We called him president. So you notice even president is actually from Latin as well. So presidens, it's a Latin word, president, which actually means president, which means to sit in front of, to sit in front of. You will be surprised. We actually borrowed that also from England. In England, they had a Lord President of the Council of State. The Council of State was part of the Privy Council, so they were advisors, private advisors to the king. The king selected himself prior to the ascendancy of the Parliament. So the king had a a privy council. It was from this privy council that the cabinet ministers we have today, the cabinet ministers are the ones who run the government, and they come from parliament. It was from this privy council that the cabinet ministers evolved. It still exists today, privy council, but they're just ceremonial, just as the king himself, his rule is ceremonial. And there's a reason why the British continue to have the king as a ceremonial figure, because, when they did away with the king, the generals started going to war against themselves. There was chaos, right, in the 17th century, and they decided to just bring him back and limit his power. So he was symbolic in uniting the nation, and it creates stability till today. It creates stability, so you see that symbolism is there. Uh, but they separated his powers. So he's the head of state, uh, while the prime minister is the head of government. In America, our president is our head of state and he's the head of government as well. So he embodies those two things. And so it's very interesting to just see the evolution of our government. Um, I'm going to keep this short here and I'll do subsequent videos. I just wanted to discuss how, you know, this, because I thought today was Sunday, was a good idea to show the source of uh, how the English kings, why they kept claiming divine rights, and they claim that divine rights from it comes from the Bible, right? I read the English, King James version. Of course, prior to the King James version translation being done, which was just translating the Latin and the Greek text and the Hebrew text into an English version, because previously the church had prohibited the translation of the Bible in vernacular languages, and the church sort of had a monopoly on reading the Bible. The church was responsible for education, which they still are responsible for today. Today, our Ivy Leagues, Harvard, these were actually started by ministers, right? People who were going into the clergy. So John Harvard himself, who donated his books and some money to establish Harvard. John Harvard himself was a minister, and he'd gone to, I think he graduated from Cambridge. So he was trained. So the people who were going into the clergy were highly trained, were the most, were the best trained people. So they sort of, education was their jurisdiction. That's the church. That was their purview at that time. And so um, it's kind of interesting that, yes, the King James Bible came in English language, in Shakespearean language, early modern English. I've done a video discussing the evolution of the English language, and so you see it's written in Shakespearean language, early modern English. But prior to that, of course, there was the Latin versions of the Bible, including the Vulgate, and it was from there I read Romans chapter 13, especially verses from verse 1 to 7. It shows that the Bible is saying, the apostles, that was written by Apostle Paul, he's saying that, well, it's the power of the king, the power of rulers comes from God, and people should obey and even, pay taxes, pay their dues, right? So even Jesus said it, right? Give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, right? That was on the issue of taxes when they had gone to ask Jesus Christ about paying taxes, and so the kings, saw the Bible as their authority, that they had divine rights from God, but over time, Parliament started to chip away, and this is something that we're not often taught they don't teach in American schools. In American schools, when they're talking about why the founding fathers broke away, they don't go into English history and show the parallels, the patterns in English history. Instead, they focus more on philosophy and idealism, right? They say, well, the the ideas of the philosophers like John Locke. John Locke thought of government as being based on the consent of the government and things like that. And if if uh, if the citizens, the subjects, don't think that the government is working for them, they have a right to overthrow the government. All these things, of course, are in the Declaration of Independence. And so they normally focus more on the philosophers and the values of the Enlightenment, which they claim our founding fathers were following. Our founding fathers were scholars. Although he wasn't using it at the time because he was at the convention. He was at a convention at a meeting. That's were they in Philadelphia when they declared independence, when he wrote the Declaration. That's Thomas Jefferson. He had his library of over 6,000 volumes, 6,000 almost 6,500 volumes that he could always confer with, and he read a lot extensively, and these things were in his memory. And of course, when James Madison was drafting the Constitution and Bill of Rights, he had his 4,000 volumes of books as well, and these included English history, right? English history, of course, included English thought. I'm going to stop here. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents. I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court, which a corrupt judge in Montgomery County, James Bonifant, has done. He's committed he's suborned perjury. He's committed fraud on the court himself. He's told lies in court, violating my rights. I was wrongfully detained for almost 15 months based on lies, based on fraud on the court. I'm seeking a redress of my grievances. I'm seeking justice. These illegal, these abysmal, barbaric acts were done, of course, violating the rule of law, violating my constitutional rights. These were done in order to obstruct justice in an equal employment opportunity complaint I had filed concerning my rights. And I'm an American citizen, and the Maryland government was co-opted by a rogue leadership in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy, rogue attorneys in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy. I've called for an investigation. I've written Congress, and they need to investigate rogue agents of the Department of Defense and the Department of the Navy committing fraud, violating the rights of American citizens, and who have co-opted the powers of the state of Maryland and their law enforcement to commit crimes, to commit robbery under color of law, to even attempt extrajudicial killings. I was robbed, I was tasered, I was shot in the head. I still have stitches from the shooting. I was tasered multiple times as they were attempting to kill me. I was gassed with tear gas in my apartment. I'm not a criminal. I don't own a gun. I've never owned a gun. I'm a middle-aged American man, no criminal history. I was working in the Department of the Navy as an auditor as of May 16, 2023, when this event occurred. I'd reported fraud. That's my right. I reported fraud, misconduct to the Office of Inspector General, and I had pending EEOC complaints. These are things that, these are my rights to petition. And of course, the process was going on. However, rogue agents of the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy then suborned a demented old man, a fabulous Jide Iware, to impersonate himself as my uncle and to tell lies, to fabricate an emergency evaluation petition, which ostensibly brought 40 cops to my home, a helicopter, the way they came, like they came to pick a terrorist, right? And so, in fact, we've not known the truth. We haven't been told what really happened, because they've been spreading all sorts of false information, disinformation, and the Montgomery County Circuit Court under Judge James Bonifant, he's kept this smoke and mirrors, this charade, and this maze of mirrors, maze of lies, kaleidoscope of lies. He's kept it going, and the Montgomery County Circuit Court of Maryland is a disgrace. They're a kangaroo court, a puppet for the Department of the Defense, Department of Navy, and you see the corruption, of the corrupting influence on the United States government, violating the integrity of our government, violating, impugning the values of Americans. In any event, I'll keep you posted. Thank you.